Hello guys, welcome to Hidden Timelines. Tonight we are stepping behind the velvet curtains of Tudor power into a chamber where majesty and decay shared the same air. Picture this, the year is 1580. You are not an ordinary traveller, nor even a merchant. You are a diplomat summoned to one of the most glittering courts in Europe. England's Queen Elizabeth Tudor, the Virgin Queen herself, waits to receive you. Her name echoes across the continent, defier of Rome, vanquisher of conspiracies, patron of Shakespeare, ruler of a restless realm balanced between Reformation and Renaissance. You enter Whitehall. Sunlight pours through stained glass, scattering jewelled light across polished stone. The chamber smells of roses, incense, beeswax candles. At the far end stands Elizabeth, resplendent in silks, heavy with embroidery, her red wig studded with pearls. Every movement she makes seems deliberate, calculated, theatrical. She is the living symbol of England's defiance. And then she speaks. Before we continue, if this tale keeps you company tonight, leave a like and subscribe. Only if it truly feels natural. And now softly tell me, where are you listening from, and what hour has the night brought you? The sound is commanding, but before the words even reach you, something else strikes. First, the smell. It slams into you like a fist so sharp and fetid that your eyes water and your stomach twists. You fight to keep your composure. An ambassador does not gag in the face of a monarch, yet you cannot stop. The thought is something rotting inside her. This was no isolated impression. Letters carried back to Spain, to France, to the Holy Roman Empire spoke in whispers of the Queen of England's mouth. Courtiers murmured in private, servants wrote in secret. To approach Elizabeth closely was to risk being overwhelmed by a stench that seemed almost funereal. Her smile, immortalized in portraits as radiant, was in truth a graveyard of decayed teeth and festering gums. And yet despite this reality, no one dared confront her directly, for Elizabeth was not just a woman with failing health. She was an institution, a sovereign whose very body was bound to the destiny of her nation. Here in this opening scene lies the paradox that will shape our journey tonight. Elizabeth Ferrers was one of the most powerful rulers in English history, the architect of a golden age, the terror of her enemies. But behind the throne her flesh was collapsing. The body that had to embody majesty was rotting beneath perfumes, wigs and paint. And she knew it. Her entire adult life became a theatre of concealment, a ritual of maintaining an illusion at any cost. Diplomats were shocked not only by the stench of her breath, but by the contradictions of her person. She could debate with razor intelligence, charm with wit, thunder with authority, and yet the very moment she smiled, her words were undermined by the odour of decay. One Spanish envoy confessed that her presence was dazzling, but her mouth is a graveyard. He meant it literally. This grotesque truth wasn't a matter of mere eccentricity. It was the product of an age where medicine was superstition, hygiene was ritual, and cosmetics were poison. Elizabeth lived at a time when fear of water could dictate bathing, when sugar newly arrived from colonies was more dangerous than gunpowder, and when the divine image of a monarch mattered more than the health of her flesh. And Elizabeth, perhaps more than any other ruler of her century, understood that image was survival. She had inherited a throne wrapped in scandal, threatened by Catholic powers abroad and rivals at home. She could not marry without igniting civil war. She could not appear weak without inviting invasion. So she embraced the mask so completely that the mask consumed her. But that mask was not just metaphorical. It was painted on with Venetian clarus, a deadly mix of vinegar and lead. It was perfumed with layers of musk and rose oil to conceal the absence of soap and water. It was woven into wigs that covered bald patches caused by poison itself. Each element of her carefully crafted majesty was also a step toward physical ruin. To understand Elizabeth's reign is to understand this double life, the radiant virgin queen adored by poets and painters, and the decaying woman who terrified her own attendants with the smell of her chamber. Tonight we will peel back the layers of paint, perfume and ceremony. We will look not only at the grotesque realities of her hygiene and cosmetics, but also at the deeper forces that shape them, the politics of image, the theology of the royal body, the cultural fears of disease and weakness. This is not a simple story of bad teeth or filthy wigs. It is the story of how a monarch turned her own body into a battlefield between power and mortality. Imagine Isen, that ambassador forced to bow low in reverence while his senses screamed for escape. He could not show disgust. To recoil would be an insult to England itself. He had to stand firm, eyes watering as Elizabeth's words, half obscured by missing teeth, half smothered by clove oil and rose petals, carried the fate of treaties and alliances. This was the reality of diplomacy in Tudor England: to smile through rot, to negotiate through nausea, to pretend that the majesty of the Virgin Queen was untouched by human frailty. But behind the scenes, in whispers and in secret writings, the truth leaked out. Attendants described her gowns stiff with oil and sweat. Servants fainted in the suffocating air of her chamber. Doctors muttered of her refusal to accept treatment. And all the while, Elizabeth's legend grew greater, not lesser. For the paradox of her reign was this: the more her body decayed, the more she doubled down on myth. She once said, "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king." That line is remembered as a declaration of political will at Tilbury, but it was also in a way the truth of her private life. Her body was frail, feeble, sickened by age and by her own rituals. Yet her determination to maintain her kingly image never faltered, and that is why her story continues to fascinate. Because Elizabeth I is not simply a figure in lace and pearls. She is a reminder that power cannot escape flesh, that even monarchs rot beneath their crowns, and that sometimes the most enduring legacies are built not on what people truly were, but on what they forced the world to see. In the chapters ahead, we will descend into the intimate horrors of her court, her sugar-rotted teeth, her terror of water, her perfumes, and paints her wigs alive with vermin, and the final grotesque collapse of her body after death. This is not a sanitized Tudor pageant. It is the story of illusion, obsession, and the hidden cost of monarchy. So stay with us as we open the first door into the secret chamber of Elizabeth's reign. Elizabeth's mouth was not merely a personal misfortune. It became a courtly secret, a burden that everyone in her orbit was forced to carry. What began in her 20s as mild discomfort soon spiraled into a chronic affliction that both horrified and defined her reign. The root of it all was sweetness. In Tudor England, sugar was no longer a rare spice hoarded by apothecaries, it was the ultimate luxury. Shipments flowed in from England's new Caribbean ventures, arriving in cones of crystallized white gold. Sugar was not only an indulgence, it was a declaration of wealth, proof that England had joined the age of global empire. To consume sugar was to consume status, and Elizabeth adored it. Candied violets, preserved fruits, gingerbread latticed with icing, all were staples of her table. The Queen's teeth, once praised for their evenness, began to surrender under the onslaught. It was a fate shared by many nobles, but in Elizabeth's case the rot advanced with terrible speed. By her 40s her mouth was a ruin. Gums inflamed and swollen enamel eaten away, teeth blackened until they resembled pegs in a battlefield churned with blood and mud. Foreign envoys were stunned. They described audiences where the Queen, radiant in jewels, opened her lips to reveal a sight more fitting for a grave than a throne. "Her mouth is a tomb," one Spanish visitor wrote, yet no one in her presence dared recoil. To flinch at the Queen's smile was to insult England itself. Diplomats endured the stench in silence, bowing lower, coughing discreetly into sleeves, leaving the chamber with letters full of horror. The decay was not inevitable. Even in the 16th century, nobles experimented with dental care. Some rubbed their teeth with soot or charcoal, others with salt-crushed coral or even ash of burnt rosemary. A few daring souls rinsed with urine, believing its ammonia could cleanse enamel. Elizabeth rejected these crude remedies. Instead, she trusted a sweet cure, honey, which she thought would coat her teeth in protection. The irony was brutal. Honey only fed the bacteria gnawing at her gums, quickening the collapse. Chewing became agony. The Queen's kitchen adapted in silence. Meat was boiled until it dissolved into paste bread, softened into pulp vegetables, reduced to grey broth. The grand banquets of the Tudor court, meant to display abundance and power, became charades. Guests feasted. Elizabeth nibbled. Servants rushed to whisk dishes away before anyone noticed her untouched plate. Yet Elizabeth would not acknowledge weakness. Pain was one thing, vulnerability another. When her doctors dared to suggest extractions, she treated it as an insult to her sovereignty. One court physician urged her to let him pull a rotted tooth. She laughed and issued a cruel command. "Prove it does not hurt. Pull one of your own first." The man obeyed. In front of horrified attendants, he had one of his molars yanked. He screamed, bled, collapsed. Elizabeth simply smiled through clenched jaw, through throbbing pain, and walked away. The message was unmistakable. She would rather endure decay than be seen as weak. It was an attitude rooted not only in her pride but also in the ideology of monarchy. The Tudors embraced the doctrine of the king's two bodies, the body natural subject to sickness and frailty, and the body politic eternal, perfect, divinely ordained. For a woman to occupy this role was already precarious. Any sign of fragility could be used against her by enemies at home and abroad. To admit dental agony, to sit with a gap-toothed mouth, would be to concede she was only flesh. Elizabeth refused. She turned her jaw into a fortress of endurance. To mask the stench, she resorted to rituals. She chewed cloves and cardamom stuffed rose petals against her gums, dabbed wine on ulcers. Silver spoons and goblets were fashioned not only to gleam, but to distract from her grimace. Yet nothing could entirely hide the odour. Foreign dignitaries left her presence, dizzy eyes watering. Brilliant in mind, majestic in bearing, yet her breath of death undoes all, lamented one observer. The effect rippled even into her rhetoric. Elizabeth had been celebrated as one of the greatest orators of her age, her speeches sharp and commanding. But as her teeth rotted away, her diction faltered. Words blurred, consonants softened. Playwrights at court adjusted scripts, choosing lines less likely to betray her collapsing mouth. The queen, who once dazzled with eloquence, became increasingly muffled, her brilliance cloaked by a ruined smile. Still the mask had to hold. Public dining became performance. Elizabeth would raise her goblet high, smile with majesty, and then slip discreetly behind a silken screen to eat in private. Courtiers were sworn to silence. None dared remark on her suffering. Some, however, wrote in secret of the unbearable reek that seemed to linger even after she left a room. One maid confessed in a letter that she had wept after tending the queen at supper, the smell clinging to her gown until she burned it. Elizabeth's physicians grew desperate. They proposed filling her teeth with thin layers of gold, a practice tried in Italy. She refused. Herbal rinses were suggested. She accused their makers of witchcraft. Ultimately, the rot invaded her jaw itself. Pain radiated into her temples, her neck, her very skull. Yet the queen continued to smile, continued to project an image of unshaken majesty. This is the paradox that defines her reign. The Virgin Queen defeated the Spanish Armada, ruled without a husband, outlasted assassins, and forged a dynasty. But she could not conquer her own teeth. And rather than admit weakness, she turned that battlefield inward, forcing herself to endure agony that would have broken most mortals. In the glittering halls of Whitehall, her smile was more than a smile. It was a tomb, a graveyard of bone and sugar, guarded by silence and gilded by power. And yet, as we will see, her teeth were only the beginning. For Elizabeth's body carried many more secrets, secrets of water, perfume, paint, and decay. If her mouth was a graveyard, the rest of her flesh was becoming a battlefield. Court banquets in Tudor England were not simply meals, they were spectacles, each one as carefully staged a pause as a play by Shakespeare himself. For Elizabeth, they became even more so, a delicate choreography designed to conceal pain, disguise frailty, and transform private weakness into public majesty. Imagine the scene, the long tables set beneath hammer-beam ceilings, banners draped in heraldic colours, the air thick with spices imported at ruinous cost, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. Courtiers filled the benches in strict order of precedence, every place at the table an announcement of hierarchy. At the high end sat Elizabeth, framed in candlelight, her gown shimmering with seed pearls, her hands poised on silver goblets that glittered in the firelight. To those present, the banquet was a demonstration of plenty. England might have been battered by famine or plague outside the palace walls, but here platters of roasted swan and gilded venison testified to royal power. Yet for Elizabeth herself the banquet was torment. Chewing had become agony, each bite a lance of pain in her jaw. The queen who presided over feasts could scarcely eat them. So a ritual developed. Elizabeth would lift a goblet of wine, smiling broadly as though savouring the moment. Her courtiers raised their cups in unison. Then, as musicians struck their lutes, she would slip discreetly behind a curtain or decorative screen. Out of sight, she pressed morsels of boiled meat into her mouth, grimacing with each bite. What the court witnessed was not consumption, but performance, an illusion of plenty, never the reality. Even utensils played their role. Elizabeth had silver forks and spoons crafted with elongated stems so that her lips might touch metal, not food in public. The shimmer of silver caught candlelight, distracting onlookers from the fact that she ate almost nothing. Meals became theatre, and Elizabeth, the star actress, concealing suffering with regal stagecraft. In this she resembled not a monarch at table, but a stage manager controlling every sightline. No one in the hall could see the contortions of her jaw, the wincing as a piece of bread scraped against a dying tooth. What they saw was majesty, a sovereign who dined like a goddess, her every gesture rehearsed. The political stakes of this concealment were immense. Elizabeth ruled as a woman in a world that doubted female strength. To show fragility at table was to invite whispers that she could not sustain a kingdom. In Tudor culture, food was power, who you ate with, what you ate, how you ate it. To falter while chewing was to falter as queen, so she banished weakness from sight. Playwrights too adapted to her condition. Elizabeth adored theatre, but by her later years, her speech had grown thick, her diction blurred by missing teeth. Shakespeare himself, keenly aware of royal favour, is thought to have shaped dialogue for court performance with the queen in mind, avoiding consonant clusters that might betray her struggle. His merry monarch could laugh without tripping over words because the words themselves had been softened for her. Thus, even the language of the age bent to accommodate the queen's decaying mouth. Yet the court knew the truth. Servants whispered of her chambers after supper, thick with the odour of cloves and cardamom meant to mask infection. One maid admitted that the stench lingered on her own clothes, forcing her to burn a gown after tending the queen's table. But in the hall no one flinched. To wrinkle a nose to hesitate in raising a goblet was to risk exile. Etiquette became weaponized silence. Courtiers trained themselves to bow at precise moments, to laugh when she smiled to pretend they did not notice her retreat behind silken drapes. In truth, Elizabeth was directing them like a conductor orchestrating their movements, so her frailty remained hidden. It was politics at its most theatrical. The Tudor court as stage set her body as both script and scenery. The irony was stark. These feasts of abundance meant to display the monarchy's might also displayed its most fragile illusion. Behind the screen, the Virgin Queen laboured over every mouthful, her jaw quivering, her throat working to swallow food reduced to pulp. Then when ready, she emerged once more regal and radiant, the illusion intact. This concealment reflected a broader Tudor obsession, the control of sight. What the monarch revealed, and just as crucially what the monarch hid, was as political as any law or treaty. Portraits were touched up to erase flaws, masks and pageants staged to display fertility or chastity, depending on need and access to the queen's body tightly managed by ritual. In such a world, Elizabeth's banquets were another mask, another pageant. To modernise, the secrecy might appear pitiable, but to her courtiers it was mesmerising. The very act of pretending not to notice bound them into complicity. Each noble who endured the charade became part of the illusion, and thus part of Elizabeth's power. And so the banquets of Whitehall and Greenwich became theatres of deception. Music swelled, goblets clinked, and the Virgin Queen presided like a goddess, while just beyond the curtain she grimaced over spoonfuls of boiled broth, each bite another small act of war against her own body. In those hidden moments, Elizabeth transformed weakness into ritual, turning even the simplest act of eating into a weapon of sovereignty. Her court, like an audience, saw only the performance she allowed them to see. But the toll of this relentless concealment was mounting. Pain never eased, the odour never lifted. Diplomats continued to whisper, and Elizabeth's determination to mask frailty would only grow more desperate as her body betrayed her in other ways. For if her teeth forced her into theatrical banquets, her fear of water would soon drive her into stranger rituals still. Elizabeth Tudor knew pain, but more importantly she knew what pain meant in the eyes of others. For an ordinary subject, wincing or crying out could be forgiven. For a queen, especially a woman who ruled alone in a world that mistrusted female authority, any sign of weakness was dangerous. Her attendants saw her jaw swell, saw her face pale, and begged her to allow extraction of the rotting teeth that tormented her. They offered herbal rinses, gold fillings, even risky surgical interventions. Elizabeth refused them all. Not because she was oblivious to the agony, but because she understood what yielding would symbolize. When one physician suggested pulling a tooth, she answered with the legendary challenge, "Pull one of your own first." He obeyed, screaming as the iron pliers tore his flesh. He collapsed bleeding while Elizabeth turned away with grim satisfaction. She had proved her point. She would not be made into a spectacle of weakness. A queen could not flinch. In this, Elizabeth was performing not just for her court, but for history itself. Tudor ideology held that a monarch possessed two bodies. The body natural was mortal, vulnerable, subject to illness and decay, but the body politic was immortal, perfect, a divine vessel of sovereignty. Kings had long used this doctrine to separate their frailties from their authority. For Elizabeth, the stakes were higher. She was a woman in a man's role, and every rival from Catholic Spain to Mary Queen of Scots looked for cracks in her image. To admit to pain was to risk collapsing the careful fiction that she was not simply a woman, but England incarnate. If her body faltered, the body politic might falter with it. So she learned to endure. When her speech thickened because of missing teeth, she trained herself to slow her cadence, disguising muffled words with careful rhetoric. When her jaw throbbed during council meetings, she clenched her hands in her lap until her knuckles whitened, letting no flicker of discomfort cross her face. Diplomatic letters recorded the paradox. Spanish envoys marvelled at her brilliance in negotiation, her keen intelligence, her ability to dance around traps laid by their masters. Yet in the same paragraphs they whispered of her blackened mouth, her breath fouler than a charnel house. These dispatches reveal a sovereign at once admired and pitied, revered and mocked. Elizabeth read some of these reports herself, smuggled back to her court. She did not soften her habits in response. If anything, she hardened them. Endurance became her weapon. Each time she refused treatment, she was making a political calculation. Better to be in pain and seen as unyielding than to be momentarily relieved and risk exposure as fragile. Pain became a performance of strength. The women of her household saw this most clearly. They dressed her in layers of perfumed gowns, dabbed rose oil against her gums, and stood helpless as she tried to chew soft bread. They knew how much she suffered, but they also knew she would not allow pity. To show her compassion was to insult her resolve. Maids wrote secretly of fainting at the stench when she leaned close, yet they also recorded her fierce eyes, warning them into silence. The paradox extended to her public oratory. Elizabeth was famed as one of the greatest speakers of her age, able to ignite troops at Tilbury or soothe Parliament with carefully chosen words. But behind the legend was a woman whose diction was increasingly warped by decay. Some of her speeches preserved in transcripts are strikingly sparse in hard consonants, suggesting they were tailored to her failing teeth. She insisted on delivering them anyway, refusing to let illness silence her voice. Her refusal was gendered resistance as much as political necessity. Male monarchs could admit to ailments and still be taken seriously. Henry VIII's ulcers, for example, did not dethrone him, but a woman's body was always scrutinized for signs of incapacity. Rumors of menstruation, infertility, or disease could be wielded as weapons. Elizabeth knew this, and she resolved never to give her enemies such a weapon. Enduring pain without flinching became central to her identity. "I may have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she would later declare, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king." That line remembered from Tilbury was not mere rhetoric. It was a creed she lived privately long before she spoke it publicly. Every clenched jaw at supper, every sleepless night spent pressing cloves to her gums, every refusal to let a doctor touch her. These were rehearsals in sovereignty. She was proving to herself and to anyone watching that her body might decay, but her will would not. In this, Elizabeth was not only resisting pain, she was weaponizing it. Each grimace suppressed each groan. Swallowed reinforced the myth of the Virgin Queen, eternal, untouchable above the ordinary frailties of women. Her endurance became a political theology, and yet the cost was immense. Diplomats noted that her words grew more difficult to understand. Courtiers whispered that she smiled less often, hiding her ruined teeth behind pursed lips. Even her laughter, once described as infectious, grew sharp and tight as though it hurt to release. The mask of endurance was also a muzzle. But still she held it. Elizabeth would rather choke on her own pride than admit frailty before men who doubted her right to rule. Her attendants, her diplomats, her playwrights all colluded in the silence. Together they built a theatre where agony could not exist, where the Queen's endurance was transformed into majesty. Yet behind the theatre curtain the pain never stopped. Her jaw throbbed, her speech faltered, her meals dissolved into mush. And while her mouth became the most visible battlefield, it was only the beginning. For Elizabeth's obsession with image would soon lead her to war against water itself. For most of us, water is the essence of life, cleansing, cooling, renewing. But to Elizabeth Tudor it was an enemy. The Virgin Queen feared water not only in her cup but on her skin. It is easy from our modern vantage point to scoff. Yet in her time, suspicion of bathing was not madness, it was medicine. Physicians of the late 16th century warned that water far from purifying could poison. They believed the skin to be porous, a thin veil, through which invisible vapours might slip. To immerse oneself too often was to invite sickness into the bloodstream. Elizabeth's own doctors reinforced the fear. One cautioned her that a single bath might leave her spirit drowned from within. Another warned that warm water opened the flesh to malign airs. The Queen listened. She had endured too much uncertainty in her youth, the Tower of London plots executions to take chances now with unseen threats. So she turned her suspicion into law for her own body. Water would not touch her. Her reasoning was fed by the world around her. Tudor London was not a city of fountains and fresh rivers. Its Thames was a highway of sewage choked with waste and the offal of butchers. Chamber pots emptied from windows splattered into alleys. Dead animals bobbed in the current. Plague visited season after season, and though no one knew of microbes, they knew that filth killed. Physicians explained it through miasma, the belief that foul air carried pestilence. Bad smells were not just unpleasant, they were deadly. If stench killed, then fragrance must heal. Elizabeth accepted this logic with fervour. Her enemies might say she reeked of putrid sweetness, but to her perfume was purity. The bath, by contrast, was a grave. And so her attendants adapted her rituals. Each morning, instead of soap and water, they dabbed her skin with cloth steeped in rosewater vinegar or spiced wine. It was not cleaning, it was perfuming. Sweat oils and powders accumulated sealed beneath her gowns. The courtiers smelled incense and sandalwood, not soap, but beneath the fragrance lay layers of grime. This paranoia was not uniquely Elizabeth's. Across Europe, nobles recoiled from bathing. French courtiers believed washing might weaken the marrow. In Spain, royal physicians warned that immersion unbalanced the humours. In Germany, plague ordinances forbade public bathhouses altogether, fearing they spread contagion. What made Elizabeth remarkable was not that she feared water, but that she elevated the fear into obsession. Her rare attempts at bathing became ceremonies of spectacle. She possessed a porcelain tub inlaid with cherubs carried with her on royal progresses. When she did consent to use it, attendants lined the basin with violets and marigolds. Lukewarm water was poured slowly, blessed by a priest, before it touched her flesh. She lowered herself in silence, surrounded by maids who bowed their heads so as not to look upon her body. She soaked not to scrub, but to steep hours in a floral broth that grew darker by the minute. When she emerged, she was wrapped not in linen, but satin intended to seal whatever radiance the ritual bestowed. To modern eyes it was grotesque. To Elizabeth it was sacred. She believed that fragrance was strength, that sweat was purgation, that the water she avoided carried death. The wider context sharpened her conviction. Public health in Tudor England was fragile at best. Open sewers ran through city streets. Rats carried fleas that sparked waves of plague. Physicians advised scattering herbs, lavender, rosemary, rue, not to mask odours but to repel disease. Even Parliament debated the stench of the Thames, fearing it might kill them while they sat in session. In such a world, Elizabeth's conviction that water was dangerous was not entirely irrational. It was an absolutization of common fear turned into personal ritual. Her rejection of bathing also aligned with the courtly language of the senses. To the Tudor elite, scent was not cosmetic, it was diagnostic. A foul odour meant illness, corruption, death. A sweet odour meant vitality, divine favour, health. If Elizabeth smelled of roses and musk, then she was well. To surround herself with fragrance was to surround herself with protection. Ambassadors did not agree. One French envoy described her chamber as a sweetness spoiled the odour of wilted petals laced with something rotten. A Spanish letter compared the air to incense in a closed tomb. Yet to Elizabeth those very smells were evidence of purity. Her body exuded divine aroma, she claimed, and her dreams were guided by her scent. Her attendants, of course, knew differently. One maid confided that the Queen's nightgown had grown so stiff with sweat and oil that it could stand upright on its own. Still they obeyed, layering perfume upon perfume, converting her chamber into a fog of musk and lavender. Elizabeth's aversion to water was more than personal paranoia. It was a political tool. By refusing to wash, she reinforced the illusion of otherworldliness. Her subjects might bathe in rivers and tubs, but their queen transcended such mortal acts. She was not to be seen sweating in bathhouses or scrubbing in basins. She was to be smelled like a reliquary, glimpsed like an icon. The Virgin Queen did not wash, she radiated. In this paradox lies the heart of her reign. Water, the element of cleansing, was to Elizabeth the substance of corruption. Perfume, the artifice of concealment, became her definition of purity. She inverted the natural order to preserve the myth of majesty. And yet behind the scented curtains her flesh paid the price. Sweat fermented beneath her corset, sores festered where cloth and oil trapped moisture, and the very perfumes meant to protect her slowly poisoned her skin. But she would not relent. For Elizabeth to bathe was to risk death. to Perfume was to court immortality. Every morning in Elizabeth's chambers began not with water, but with ritual. Her attendants did not bring basins of soap and cloth. Instead, they arrived bearing bowls filled with fragrant liquid wine infused with vinegar, rose water steeped with herbs. Linen squares were dipped and gently pressed against the queen's skin. It was not cleansing, it was consecration. The purpose was never to remove sweat or grime, but to smother it beneath scent. The Tudor court believed that what smelled sweet was healthy, and what smelled foul was deadly. This was the logic of miasma, the theory that plague and fevers travelled through corrupted air. Elizabeth more than anyone internalized this belief. To her, fragrance was armour, a shield that cloaked her from sickness as surely as gilded plate protected a knight. Thus, layer by layer, the transformation began. Myrrh imported from the eastern Mediterranean was dabbed at her wrists. Musk harvested from deer glands was smeared in small drops behind her ears. Sandalwood ground to powder was tucked into sachets sewn into her corset. These were not mere cosmetics. They were talismans, each scent carrying its own symbolic and medicinal weight. Myrrh was associated with purity musk, with vitality sandalwood, with calmness and longevity. Together they created an invisible barrier of health. Her gowns reinforced this fragrant fortress. Elizabeth wore multiple layers, smocks, kirtles, farthingales, bodices, outer gowns, each fabric absorbing and holding scent. Linen was the closest to her body, yet it was seldom changed. Washing linen required water, which she distrusted, and labour, which she disdained. One maid complained that her chemises grew so heavy with oils and perspiration that they hardened into stiffness. Another whispered that a discarded nightgown left upright in a corner stood on its own like a mannequin. The chamber itself became part of the performance. Herbs dangled from rafters, rosemary for remembrance, lavender for calm rue to ward off pestilence. Bowls of dried petals smouldered on coals. Incense sticks burned with frankincense, thickening the air with smoke. Visitors described stepping into a fog of perfume so dense it clung to skin and clothing long after departure. One French ambassador wrote of a sweetness spoiled like roses left too long in the sun. Another compared the atmosphere to incense within a closed tomb. This paradox defined Elizabeth's scent. To her it was divine, to others it was suffocating. Yet no one dared say so aloud. At court, fragrance was a language of power. To smell richly was to display wealth, to proclaim closeness to the divine. Odour marked hierarchy. The poor stank of sweat and dung, the queen radiated musk and roses. Whether or not the odour was pleasant was irrelevant. What mattered was that it was unmistakably different. Smell in Tudor culture was semiotic, a sign to be read like a heraldic badge. Perfume proclaimed chastity by masking sweat, fertility by echoing flowers, sovereignty by overwhelming lesser scents. Elizabeth wielded this symbolism with mastery. She might never bathe, but she reeked of authority. Of course her servants knew the other side. They tended to the sores that festered beneath the corset she refused to loosen. They dabbed ointments on rashes hidden by silk. They endured the clinging sweetness until they grew faint. Some secretly despised the regimen. One confessed in a letter that she burned her gown after a week's service in the Queen's chamber, unable to rid it of the ghost of spoiled perfume. But to complain aloud was unthinkable. To insult the Queen's scent was to insult the Queen herself. Elizabeth, for her part, demanded the same of those around her. Courtiers were expected to be spotless, reeking of rosewater and spice. A noble who dared approach smelling of sweat risked banishment from court for days. Even ambassadors hardened by travel doused themselves before audiences. Cleanliness at court was not cleanliness in the modern sense, it was fragrance, the ability to mask the body beneath a cloud of cultivated air. Yet behind this fragrant illusion, Elizabeth's body deteriorated. The oils and resins left unwashed clogged her pores. Sweat fermented beneath them, producing the very stench she sought to avoid. The perfumes mingling with natural odours created the sickly blend diplomats described as both sweet and rotten. Still she clung to her regimen. For Elizabeth, fragrance was not a luxury, it was survival. Each morning the dabbing of rosewater and musk reaffirmed her divinity. Each night her stiffened gowns testified to her endurance. She believed her scent guided her dreams, perhaps even her destiny. And so she perfumed herself into legend, convinced that she was not merely covering decay, but transforming it into holiness. To outsiders the irony was stark. The Virgin Queen, so radiant in portraits, was in truth a woman, hiding beneath layers of oils and unwashed cloth. Yet her people never saw the truth. They smelled roses, myrrh, sandalwood. They saw her gowns shimmer in candlelight. They heard her voice ring with authority. And in that sensory theatre she remained untouchable. In her world, perfume was not decoration. It was a mask, an armour, a crown. Behind it her body rotted, but through it her sovereignty endured. For all her terror of water, Elizabeth did not reject bathing entirely. But when she permitted it, the act was not cleansing. It was theatre. Among her possessions was a porcelain tub of extraordinary beauty, its sides painted with cherubic faces and gilded vines. Unlike the coarse wooden tubs found in taverns, or the steaming cauldrons of public bathhouses, this was a sovereign's basin, a portable throne of purity. Carried with her on royal progresses, it was as much a symbol of majesty as a crown or sceptre. When the Queen consented to use it, the ceremony was elaborate. Servants laid the bottom with petals, violets, marigolds, roses. The water, carefully warmed, was poured in slowly, never scalding, never cold. A priest blessed it with murmured prayers. Elizabeth entered not as a woman seeking relief, but as a monarch stepping into a ritual. She lowered herself into the fragrant broth and remained there for hours. She did not scrub, nor did her maids lather her skin. They stood at a distance, heads bowed, waiting. The Queen was steeped, not washed, submerged in a floral infusion that darkened as time passed. Attendants refreshed the perfume with musk or civet, not with fresh water. By the end, what filled the tub was no longer a bath, but a stew. Wilted blossoms, cloudy oils, sweat and residue from unwashed flesh. When Elizabeth rose at last, her chin was wrinkled and waxy, her body wrapped not in rough toweling but in fine satin. The satin was meant to lock in whatever radiance the ritual had conferred, sealing her as if she were a relic. One servant later likened the odour of these rare baths to funeral flowers left too long in milk. A sweetness. Cloying mingled with decay. To modern minds, such rituals might seem eccentric, even absurd, but within Elizabeth's world they carried symbolic weight. Across Europe, bathing among the elite was never about hygiene as we understand it. It was about ritual purity, theatricality, and status. Commoners might wash in rivers, scrubbing with coarse soap, but nobles staged their ablutions like sacraments. Perfumed waters were believed to draw out melancholy, to refresh the spirits, to perfume the very soul. To emerge from such a bath was to emerge renewed in essence, not in cleanliness. Yet Elizabeth's practices had consequences. Oils clung stubbornly to her pores, trapping sweat beneath corsets and bodices that were rarely loosened. Microbes flourished in the heat. Rashes blossomed on her thighs. Sores festered along her spine. Still she believed the ritual preserved her. To wash away the oils would be to wash away protection. This inversion of cleansing water feared perfume exalted was consistent with Tudor understandings of the body. Medical theory still followed Galen's humours: yellow bile, black biopsy, bile phlegm, blood. Health depended on balance. Too much cold water, doctors warned, could chill. The humours weaken the flesh and leave the body vulnerable. A scented bath, however, balanced heat with sweetness, melancholy with joy. Elizabeth transformed that theory into obsession. She did not bathe to cleanse, she bathed to confirm her divinity. Every petal scattered into her tub was part of the illusion that she was a creature above common decay. Yet behind the illusion her flesh betrayed her. The sweat sealed beneath oils fermented, mixing with perfumes into that funeral flower stench. Beneath her corset sores multiplied unseen. Her attendants pleaded with her to allow even partial washing behind the ears, beneath the arms, but she would not permit it. A physician once attempted to apply an ointment to a rash near her neck. She shrieked that he sought to drown her spirit and banished him. It is tempting to call her fear irrational, but in truth it was an absolutization of the world she inhabited. Rivers were open sewers. Public bathhouses were seen as breeding grounds of plague and vice. Foul air was deadly. Fragrance was salvation. Elizabeth simply followed these beliefs to their extreme. What makes her remarkable is not the fear itself, but the ritual she built around it. For Elizabeth, the bath became another stage. Just as banquets were choreographed performances, so too were her rare immersions. Courtiers were forbidden to look directly upon her body, just as they were forbidden to notice her faltering speech or decaying teeth. Privacy was transformed into sanctity. Even her soiled linens were treated as relics guarded by her maids sworn to silence. Thus the ceremonial bath, far from cleansing, reinforced the illusion. Elizabeth emerged not cleaner, but more scented, more sacred. Her skin waxy and perfume testified not to hygiene, but to hierarchy. The irony was cruel. By rejecting true washing, she condemned her flesh to fester, yet the more her body decayed, the more she clung to ritual. Each rare bath was a pageant of flowers and prayers, each steeping a confirmation that she was untouchable. The illusion endured. Diplomats continued to bow in suffocating chambers filled with incense. Courtiers continued to raise goblets at banquets while their queen nibbled behind curtains. And Elizabeth, wrapped in satin after her perfumed stews, convinced herself that she was preserved. But preservation was an illusion. Beneath the oils and petals, the body of the Virgin Queen was already beginning to rot. If Elizabeth's teeth were a graveyard and her breath a weapon, then her skin became a battlefield, one she would not allow anyone to win but herself. Beneath her silks and brocades, her flesh told a different story from the portraits painted on canvas. Rashes bloomed across her thighs, sores festered beneath the corset she refused to loosen, and abrasions deepened where stays and boning bit into her skin. To remove the garments to allow air and light to touch the body would have been logical, but for Elizabeth, logic bent beneath image. The corset was not merely clothing, it was control. In Tudor fashion, the pair of bodies, what we would later call the corset, was the armour of queenship. Constructed of whalebone wood or even steel stitched into stiffened linen, it shaped the torso into a rigid cone. It compressed flesh, straightened posture, and declared discipline over disorder. For Elizabeth, the pair of bodies was more than apparel, it was sovereignty made tangible. To loosen the laces would be to admit frailty, so she tightened them even as her own flesh broke under the strain. Her attendants saw the cost. Sores appeared along her ribcage, rubbed raw by stays that ground against unwashed skin. Fungal infection spread in the humid dark beneath layers of linen oil and silk. Rashes blossomed into angry red patches. Still, she would not permit them to be treated. To touch her body even with ointment was to breach a sacred boundary. When one physician attempted to apply a salve behind her ear, she screamed, accused him of witchcraft, and had him banished. This paranoia was not baseless in her worldview. Tudor medicine was tangled in superstition. Illness was explained through humours and spirits, not bacteria. Physicians prescribed charms, prayers, and astrological timings as often as herbs. To Elizabeth, an ointment smeared in secret seemed as much a curse as a cure, and yet her body cried out. Heat and sweat trapped beneath gowns and her bodices turned her skin into a breeding ground. Without water to rinse away salt, without fresh linen to absorb moisture, her epidermis suffocated. What we now recognise as dermatitis and fungal overgrowth appeared to her attendants as festering sores. They stank, they oozed, but they could not be acknowledged. Elizabeth refused not only because of fear, but because of ideology. In her mind, the sovereign body had to be flawless. The body politic, that immortal divine embodiment of England, could not be seen cracking, bleeding, or peeling. So she armoured her natural body with fabric and perfume, convincing herself the illusion was truth. The very textiles that adorned her also conspired against her. Tudor garments were layered, a linen smock, a corset stiffened with whalebone or wood, a farthingale to spread the skirts and underskirt, and overgown sleeves, collars, ruffs. Each absorbed sweat and oil, each pressed closer to the skin. Without laundering, they became stiff, abrasive, and alive with microbes. Under this weight, sores worsened. Elizabeth turned to unguents, oily salves of resin wax and herbs to soothe the irritation. But these ointments applied without washing did not heal. They sealed. The occlusive layers trapped sweat and microbes beneath, suffocating the skin further. The result was fermentation, flesh, macerated pus gathered. The odour intensified. Proto-dermatology had no language for this, only the vague terms of corruption and heat. Her attendants tried to intervene discreetly. They begged her to change her linens more often to allow the stays to loosen at night. She refused. The corset for her was not negotiable. It was the symbol of her chastity, her discipline, her refusal to yield to the flesh. To remove it was to unlace the illusion itself. Diplomats caught glimpses of the price. Some reported that the queen shifted uncomfortably on her throne, her hands twitching against her bodice as though her garments themselves wounded her. Others noticed a strange sheen on her skin when the collar of her gown slipped an oily shine that suggested ointments layered atop sores, but none dared comment. To speak of the queen's skin was to risk exile or worse, and so the illusion persisted. Portraits showed her flawless, pale and radiant. Poems compared her to Diana, goddess of the moon. Yet behind the mask her flesh was ravaged. She had created a world where to acknowledge pain was treason, where to suggest healing was witchcraft. In that silence the sores multiplied. Modern dermatology can reconstruct what her attendants only feared. The mixture of sweat oils, occlusive unguents, and rigid textiles likely produced intertrigo fungal infections and pressure ulcers. Corset abrasions created open wounds vulnerable to secondary infection. Without soap and water, bacteria flourished. Without air, healing was impossible. Elizabeth's body became a closed system of rot festering in darkness, while her portraits shone with divine light. This is the paradox we keep encountering in her reign. The more her body failed, the more she tightened control. Teeth rotted. She smiled less, but smiled anyway. Flesh blistered. She tightened her stays and painted her skin whiter. Breath stank. She chewed cloves and spoke with majesty. In every case, endurance became performance, and performance became survival. For Elizabeth, pain was not a private trial. It was a political tool. By refusing to relent, she proclaimed herself unbreakable. By accusing physicians of witchcraft, she reminded her court that no mortal hand could touch the sovereign body without consent. She transformed her suffering into another mask, another pageant, another illusion that reinforced her myth. But illusion has limits. The sores beneath her corsets, left untreated, became chronic. The stench of unwashed flesh mingled with perfume became unmistakable to those who served her. Whispers spread through embassies and courtiers alike, yet none dared act, for to expose the Queen's skin was to expose England's weakness. Thus Elizabeth's flesh, trapped beneath silk and stays, became a secret battlefield. Her body was under siege not by foreign powers, but by her own fear of vulnerability. And in that siege she refused to surrender. If Elizabeth's corsets armoured her body, then her face was the ultimate battlefield. No part of her carried greater symbolic weight, and no part endured greater abuse. What the world saw as porcelain purity was in truth a mask of poison crafted daily from one of the most dangerous substances in Renaissance Europe, Venetian ceruse. Ceruse was no ordinary powder. It was a cosmetic obsession, a substance revered from London to Florence, produced by artisans in Venice, who soaked strips of lead in vinegar until the metal bloomed into a white crust. The crust was then ground into a soft powder and mixed with oils or water, creating a paste that gleamed with unnatural brightness. In candlelight it shimmered like marble. In daylight it glowed with the cold pallor of the divine. It was expensive, laborious to make, and thus reserved for the highest ranks. To wear it was to announce wealth and status. To wear it, as Elizabeth did daily obsessively, was to declare immortality. The Queen had her reasons. At the age of 29, she survived smallpox, a disease that ravaged Europe in waves, leaving scars even on those who lived. Elizabeth recovered, but her skin bore the pits and marks of battle. For a woman who had built her reign on the illusion of eternal beauty, these scars were intolerable. So she turned to ceruse not as an ornament, but as salvation. Every morning her maids applied the paste in layers, first to smear across the cheeks, then the forehead, then the chin, until her entire face shone with uniform whiteness. More was dabbed onto her neck, her décolletage, even her hands. Each layer concealed the scars, erased the freckles, covered the sores from corset rub. What emerged was not flesh but statue. Portraits immortalized this illusion. Painters dared not capture blemishes. The Mask of Youth series, commissioned in her later years, presented Elizabeth as unchanging, untouched by time. The orders were explicit. The Queen must be shown ageless, her skin radiant. Artists complied, retouching reality into divinity. To reveal the truth, wrinkles, pits, discoloration was unthinkable. Some whispered it could cost an artist his life. In candle-lit banquets, the effect was mesmerizing. Elizabeth appeared otherworldly, her skin gleaming like alabaster, reflecting the flames as though she herself radiated light. Poets compared her to goddesses, to the moon, to eternal Diana. The mask worked, at least in public, but beneath the mask, her flesh suffered. Ceruse did not sit harmlessly on the surface. Its lead seeped into pores, travelled into blood, and corroded organs from within. The more Elizabeth applied, the more her body absorbed. Day after day, year after year, she was poisoning herself in the name of beauty. Her skin grew dry, cracked, and ulcerated. Instead of removing the paste, she covered it with more. Maids recalled how they never fully washed it away. They merely refreshed it, patching over cracks with new layers. Over time, her features stiffened, her mobility diminished. Even a faint smile risked reopening sores. By her mid-40s, her face had hardened into expressionless majesty, regal yet rigid. The irony was cruel. The very substance that gave her the glow of divinity was destroying the flesh beneath. But Elizabeth would not stop. She believed that without Ceruse her authority would collapse. Her face was not her own, it was England's. As she once declared, "My face is my kingdom, and to expose its scars would be to expose the realm's fragility." Ceruse's power lay not only in its visual effect, but in its origin. Venetian Ceruse was the finest available prized above English or German versions. Venice's workshops had perfected the recipe clay pots sealed with horse dung. To accelerate corrosion led strips carefully tended for weeks until the white scales blossomed. Merchants carried it across Europe selling tiny jars at exorbitant prices. Elizabeth's court purchased it in bulk, ensuring that no rival could boast a purer mask. To wear Venetian Ceruse was to partake in a global trade of poison disguised as luxury. The symbolism mattered as much as the substance. White skin in Tudor England signified nobility. Peasants labouring outdoors bore tans and freckles. Queens were supposed to glow pale untouched by the sun, as though their bodies existed outside of earthly toil. Elizabeth embraced this symbolism to an extreme. Her whiteness was not natural, it was manufactured daily, with lead and vinegar at the cost of her health. Diplomats noticed the contradiction. They praised her brilliance in council, her charisma in conversation, but in private letters they mocked the mask. "The Queen's face is stiff, her features unmoving," wrote one. Another described her cheeks as plastered as though carved of stone, but these whispers never reached her throne room. There the illusion prevailed. To her subjects, Elizabeth was radiant. To her enemies, she was terrifying. The mask worked as propaganda. It convinced the world that she was unchanging, eternal, beyond the decay that consumed ordinary mortals. And yet her body told another story. Lead poisoning manifested in tremors, insomnia, paranoia. Her skin, beneath the mask, was raw, inflamed, and festering. But she endured it layer upon layer, year upon year, until the mask became inseparable from the woman. In the candle-lit courts of Europe, Elizabeth's whitened face gleamed like a beacon. In the silence of her chambers it cracked and bled beneath the paint. The Virgin Queen was not merely painted, she was entombed in poison every day of her reign. If Venetian Ceruse gave Elizabeth her deathly white canvas, then the rest of her cosmetic arsenal supplied the colours that transformed her into a living portrait. Each pigment carried not only symbolism but also poison. Her lips glowed with vermilion, a brilliant red made by grinding cinnabar mercury sulfide into fine powder. Cinnabar had long fascinated alchemists. To them mercury was a mystical substance, liquid, reflective, able to fuse with gold. Apothecaries believed cinnabar could ward off disease, tell cosmic forces, even prolong life. To Elizabeth it offered a different promise, a flush of youth, a vivid bloom of vitality. Yet every application brought her closer to mercury poisoning, for vermilion was not harmless colour, but toxic ore spread directly onto her mouth. Her cheeks bore rouge, also cinnabar-based, deepening the illusion of blood and health beneath the ghostly white of Ceruse. In candlelight her face appeared alive, radiant, ethereal. But in truth her body absorbed mercury through her skin day after day. It attacked her nervous system, corroding her health from within. Tremors shook her hands. Insomnia kept her pacing long into the night. Paranoia sharpened her temper. Servants whispered that she flew into rages over the smallest slight. Physicians, though powerless, suspected the cause lay not in spirits but in substances. Her eyes completed the illusion. To enlarge her pupils she used Atropa belladonna, the deadly nightshade. A drop of its extract blurred the world but left the eyes glistening and wide like polished jewels. In Renaissance culture, dilated pupils signified passion and allure. For Elizabeth they added another layer of majesty, deepening her gaze into something hypnotic. But belladonna is a neurotoxin. It clouded her vision, disoriented her balance, and strained her already fragile body. Ambassadors described her stare as like moons rimmed in blood. They did not know the price behind that gaze. Around her eyes she used lamp black, a mixture of soot and ash applied to darken lashes and brows. To us it seems crude, but to her court it added contrast to the pale mask. It also carried its risks. Ash and soot irritated the skin, inflamed the lids, and could grind into the eyes themselves. Yet for Elizabeth, appearance mattered more than irritation. Her face was her kingdom. The overlap between medicine and cosmetics blurred these dangers further. In Tudor apothecaries, jars of pigments sat beside jars of herbs. Mercury lead and belladonna were as likely to be prescribed for ailments as for beauty. Physicians recommended cinnabar to cool the body, belladonna to ease cramps, surus, to soothe blemishes. The same substances that adorned Elizabeth were also found in prescriptions. It was not vanity alone that drove her. Her culture told her these poisons were medicine. But some began to notice patterns. By the late 16th century, certain physicians whispered of cosmetic fevers, illnesses afflicting women who painted too heavily. They observed tremors, skin eruptions, delirium. Early toxicology was being born, though no one yet understood the chemistry. Still the warnings circulated quietly: beauty could kill. Elizabeth, however, could not afford to listen. Her symptoms intensified. Tremors in her hands made writing difficult. Sleeplessness left her exhausted, yet she insisted on hours-long audiences. Paranoia grew. She accused maids of betrayal, banished physicians she suspected of sorcery. Her temper flared, sometimes terrifyingly. These were not merely the whims of an aging queen. They were the effects of a body saturated with lead and mercury, belladonna and soot. And yet to her courtiers the mask held. She appeared radiant in portraits, glowing in candlelight, her lips red as roses, her eyes dark and wide. Pain was hidden beneath powder. Madness was explained away as majesty. This was the cruel genius of Elizabeth's regimen. Every symptom of poisoning her rages, her sleeplessness, her stiffness, only reinforced her aura of otherworldliness. She was untouchable, unpredictable, half goddess and half tyrant. Few dared to ask if her divinity was simply delirium. But those who served her closely saw the truth. Maids recalled how lifting a layer of paint from her cheek revealed raw, ulcerated flesh. One fainted at the sight. Elizabeth slapped her in fury. Still the mask went on the next day and the next and the next. Her cosmetics were not simply decoration. They were a system of survival. To appear unpainted was unthinkable. To expose scars, sores, or wrinkles was to expose weakness. And so she endured the poisons, layering them until her face became a weapon, a radiant mask that blinded her subjects to the decay beneath. It worked. The Virgin Queen's visage became one of the most enduring images in European history. The mask of youth endured not just in portraits but in memory. Few outside her chambers ever saw the ulcers, the tremors, the rages. What they saw was majesty carved in white and red, lit by torches reflected in silver mirrors. But the cost of that majesty was a body unravelling from within. In Elizabeth's court, reality was negotiable. Flesh might crack and fester, but canvas would always show divinity. For the Virgin Queen image was not merely vanity, it was law. By her middle years, mirrors vanished from her chambers. Attendants were forbidden to bring them, forbidden even to let polished silver reflect her face without permission. Elizabeth herself declared, "My face is my kingdom." It was not to be glimpsed unpainted, not even by her own eyes. Painters, therefore, became her accomplices. To paint Elizabeth was not to record a likeness, it was to participate in propaganda. Portraits were state instruments as vital as treaties or coins. Artists who dared to capture reality wrinkles, sagging flesh scars from smallpox, risked ruin. At least one painter was reportedly imprisoned for delivering a too honest image. Instead, her likeness was standardized, codified, and carefully managed by officials. In 1563, the Privy Council issued the Act of Portraiture, ordering that no unapproved image of the Queen should circulate. If artists wished to depict her, they were to use official patterns, wooden panels with her approved face traced and replicated. Workshops copied them tirelessly, producing endless variations on the same radiant visage, pale, unlined, eternal. This system reached its height in the 1590s with the Mask of Youth series. Though Elizabeth was nearing 70, the portraits presented her as ageless. Her cheeks glowed with carouse, her lips vivid with vermilion, her eyes sharp and unclouded. She was draped in pearls, symbols of virgin purity, and in gowns that seemed more armour than cloth. The likeness did not change, no matter how her body did. Workshops in London and beyond retouched earlier paintings to match the new pattern, erasing age lines, smoothing features, whitening skin. The result was a collective fiction: Elizabeth as goddess, Elizabeth as eternal. Subjects who never glimpsed her in person believed the illusion wholeheartedly. Even courtiers who knew better bowed before canvases that showed a queen untouched by time, but behind the paint the truth was impossible to hide from those who served her daily. Attendants saw the sores beneath her makeup, the trembling hands that smeared rouge unevenly, the rigid smile that cracked with pain. Still none dared to speak it. For Elizabeth's censorship was not only political, it was personal. To acknowledge her aging face was to commit treason against the body politic itself. and so her image became a kind of armour. In portraits she was Diana the Huntress, Astrea the virgin goddess of justice, Gloriana the fairy queen of Spenser's epic. Each depiction layered mythology upon myth, disguising the mortal woman beneath. Even her most intimate scars, the pockmarks from smallpox, were obliterated with strokes of lead-based paint, both on canvas and on her own skin. The politics of likeness extended beyond flattery. Portraits were diplomatic weapons. Foreign ambassadors received painted miniatures of Elizabeth sent as tokens of alliance. To present a wrinkled aging monarch would be to signal weakness. Instead, they carried home images of a radiant sovereign, ageless and commanding. The illusion reinforced England's strength abroad. Censorship went hand in hand with performance. Elizabeth controlled her presence as fiercely as her portraits. She would never allow herself to be seen without cosmetics, never let weakness intrude on the pageant. Mirrors, removed paintings, retouched speeches tailored, every detail served the same purpose to preserve the fiction that she was unchanging. And yet there was tragedy in this triumph. The queen who had survived conspiracies, defeated the Armada, and inspired poets became imprisoned by her own image. She could not age, could not falter, could not even glimpse her reflection honestly. Her public face was a mask she wore not only for the world, but for herself. To understand Elizabeth's portraits is to understand the paradox of her reign. They are not lies, but deliberate instruments of rule. They reveal not what she was, but what she needed to be. They show the Virgin Queen not as a woman of flesh and blood, but as a myth painted into eternity. Behind every canvas, hung in noble halls, behind every miniature sent across seas, lay a forbidden truth. The Queen was human, scarred, poisoned, and decaying. But that truth was erased, censored, outlawed. What endured was the mask, the state-sponsored illusion, the immortal face of Gloriana. And so as the years advanced and her flesh failed, Elizabeth's portraits told a different story. The sovereign never aged, never faltered, never succumbed to the ravages that consumed her behind closed doors. In the end, her image triumphed over her body. History remembers the paintings. Few remember the sores. If paint was Elizabeth's first mask, then wigs became her second. For beneath the towering ruffs and jewelled crowns, her natural hair was quietly disappearing, burned away by the very poisons that kept her face unnaturally white. In her youth, Elizabeth's copper-coloured hair was legendary. Courtiers compared it to fire ambassadors, to autumn leaves glowing in sunlight. But by her late 30s, the strands thinned alarmingly. Venetian ceruse, cinnabar rouge, and lamp black clogged her pores and poisoned her follicles. Each layer she painted to preserve her face stripped strength from her scalp. Bit by bit, hairline retreated, clumps fell away until her natural crown was patchy and frail. Panic was inevitable. In Tudor symbolism, hair was more than vanity. It signified strength, fertility, and vitality. To lose it was to invite whispers that the Queen herself was waning, and so Elizabeth turned to wigs perukes crafted not from her own hair, but from horse goat or the stolen tresses of maids and some whispered corpses. They were not simple coverings. Each wig was an architectural feat. Wire frames supported towering masses of curled or braided hair. The strands were glued together with animal fat, egg, and starch, then powdered white to match the pale mask of her face. Once completed, they were so delicate that even a drop of water risked undoing them. Washing was unthinkable. Instead, vinegar baths were used to cleanse them, followed by drying over red-hot coals, processes that left the interiors musty and sometimes mouldy. The starch alone was an industry. Starch makers, a rising guild in Elizabethan London, supplied the court with the powders that stiffened collars, sleeves, and wigs alike. Starch conferred status. The whiter and stiffer your attire, the higher your rank. Elizabeth's wigs, caked in the substance, became towering monuments to that culture. Each one announced not only majesty, but economic power, fed by trade routes that brought wheat and rice for starching and by labourers who risked blindness in boiling vats of lime and flour. The wigs grew higher, heavier, more elaborate with the years. Some were curled into corkscrew towers studded with pearls. Others spread outward in broad frames that extended past her shoulders. One, her favourite, was said to weigh nearly 20 pounds, supported by a steel brace fitted around her shoulders and neck. Even the very architecture of palaces bent to their height, doorways and arches in chapels were altered, so the Queen could pass without bowing her head. Ritual surrounded them. Each morning the wig chosen for the day was not simply lifted and placed, it was blessed. 2 maids, 3 guards and a chaplain oversaw the ceremony. Silence was required. If a strand fell during the process, it was buried as though it were a relic. No courtier dared touch her hairpiece without sanction. To do so was to trespass on sovereignty itself. The wigs were locked away at night, guarded as treasures. They were combed with ivory pins dusted with lavender to mask their odours and perfumed heavily before reuse. Still they decayed from within. Moisture lingered in the glue-breeding mould. Vermin found homes in the warmth and starch. Servants whispered of lice fleas, and worse crawling unseen beneath the jewelled crowns. Yet no one dared speak openly. To mock the Queen's wigs was to mock the Queen herself. When one noblewoman murmured that Elizabeth's hair smelled like wet crypts, she was swiftly exiled to Cornwall. The wigs, grotesque as they sometimes seemed, were sacrosanct. Behind the grandeur their symbolism was clear. Hair was life, youth, and divine favour. By covering her baldness with monumental wigs, Elizabeth denied mortality. Each perruque was a statement the Queen is eternal, her crown unbroken. But there was a darker irony. The very starch and powder that gave her wigs their majesty also seeped through to her scalp, aggravating the sores already festering there. Pins used to anchor the frame's pierced skin, sometimes drawing blood. Yet Elizabeth endured it as she endured all her torments, for to remove the wig was to admit vulnerability. Thus the wigs became both armour and her torment. They hid the decay-projected majesty and reinforced her myth. But beneath them her scalp was inflamed, raw and slowly poisoned. Craft guilds prospered, starch economies boomed, portraiture immortalized the towering creations. To her subjects Elizabeth was a goddess crowned in fire or pearls. To her attendants she was a woman hidden beneath horsehair and glue. Her scalp blistered, her dignity clinging to a mask of fibres. And still every morning the ritual resumed. The wig was brought forth, blessed affixed. Elizabeth straightened, lifted her chin, and walked forth as Gloriana, her hair a crown of deception. The Virgin Queen had traded her natural copper for monuments of starch and wire, and in so doing she transformed not only her image, but the very idea of monarchy. To the world, Elizabeth's wigs were monuments of majesty, flaming red towers powdered white studded with pearls and jewels, but to those who handled them daily the truth was far less divine. Beneath the starch and perfume life thrived life that no queen would ever admit adorned her crown. Servants whispered of lice that nested in the thick horsehair, fleas that leapt from wig to collar, even pale maggots wriggling where glue met scalp. One maid confessed in a secret letter that she discovered larvae crawling near the base of the Queen's headpiece one morning, but she dared not speak. To acknowledge the infestation was to risk punishment or exile. Instead, she dabbed lavender along the seams and prayed the writhing shapes would remain unseen. The wigs were cleaned only in ritual ways. True washing was impossible. Water would warp the glue, loosen the starch, and collapse the delicate architecture. So attendants turned to vinegar baths, submerging the wigs in pungent liquid to kill vermin. Afterwards they were dried over red-hot coals, their interiors steaming, sometimes singed. But vinegar did not cleanse mould, nor did heat penetrate every seam. Moisture lingered in the linings, breeding mildew that spread like moss in the damp English air. Diplomats noticed. They did not dare mention it aloud, but their letters home were filled with hints. One Italian envoy described a musty odour, not quite floral, not quite human, clinging to her head. Another joked darkly that the Queen wore a garden on her crown, though I fear it grows more than flowers. Still another claimed to have fainted mid-audience, and rumours whispered that it was not politics but her scent that toppled him. The truth was simple starch itself was bait. In Elizabeth's England, starch was a luxury bleached white with laborious care, used to stiffen ruffs, collars and wigs. But starch was food to insects. Lice and fleas burrowed into it, gnawing at the residue. Where starch and warmth combined, vermin followed. The Queen's wigs, caked in starch, perfumed with musk and heated by her body, became breeding grounds disguised as regalia. Yet these objects were treated as relics. Locked away at night, guarded by attendants, they were combed with ivory pins and dusted with herbs as though they were holy artefacts. Dropped strands were buried like saintly remains. To insult the wigs was sacrilege. One noblewoman who dared mutter that Elizabeth's hair smelled of wet crypts found herself swiftly banished to Cornwall. The wigs were not to be questioned. They were extensions of sovereignty itself. And so each morning the ritual resumed. Attendants brought forth the chosen wig, blessed it, and fixed it upon the Queen's scalp with pins and glue. The smell lingered musty and sour beneath lavender. The vermin lingered hidden beneath pearls, but no one dared recoil. To flinch in the presence of the Virgin Queen was treason to her body politic. The paradox was grotesque. Elizabeth's wigs projected majesty, yet diplomats gagged in her presence. They proclaimed her eternal, yet they decayed from within. They symbolized purity, yet teemed with vermin. But this paradox was not new to the Tudors. Throughout Europe, wigs and ruffs carried the same contradictions. Perfume was meant to mask decay starch to signify discipline, but both attracted parasites. Pest control in the 16th century consisted of vinegar, dabs, herb sachets and prayers. Rat poison was crude, flea traps unreliable. No one understood that vermin spread plague. To Elizabeth's court, pests were nuisances, not dangers. The real danger was acknowledging them in the Queen's presence. Thus, Elizabeth's wigs lived in a strange duality, at once symbols of sacred majesty and nests of living corruption. Courtiers bowed low, inhaling musk and mildew. Ambassadors returned home with stories of her brilliance, her radiance, and in private her smell. Servants whispered in fear-masking infestations with lavender and rosewater. And Elizabeth herself never admitted the truth. To her the wigs were crowns, monuments of immortality. Whatever crawled beneath was irrelevant. In this way her diadems became more than fashion. They became relics of illusion, guarded with the same reverence as regalia, and like relics they carried their own secret rot. By the final decade of her reign, Elizabeth's wigs were no longer ornaments. They were prisons. Her scalp, raw from years of powders, glue and vermin, could no longer bear their weight unaided. To support them, smiths fashioned custom iron meshes, delicate lattices curved to the shape of her skull. These frames bore the burden of towering perukes that weighed 10, sometimes 20 pounds. Yet the braces did not rest harmlessly. They dug into her flesh, pressing against open sores, embedding themselves in ulcers that never healed. Pins anchored the wigs to this iron skeleton. Dozens of them, some sharp enough to draw blood. Attendants described her wincing as they fixed the crown each morning, blood seeping where pins pierced too deep. Yet she never cried out. To protest was weakness. To flinch was treason against her own image. The infections grew worse. Physicians begged her to let her sin breathe to rest without the wig for even a few days. She snapped at them. "My scalp is not subject to peasant science, it holds the crown." The statement revealed her creed. Her body was not her own. It was England's. Any blemish upon it was a blemish upon the Commonwealth. To let her scalp go bare would be to suggest the nation itself was cracked. This ideology was deeply Tudor. Monarchy was not just politics, but mysticism. The sovereign's body symbolized the body politic, the health of the realm reflected in the health of the ruler. Henry VIII had hidden his ulcerated leg behind armour and hose. Elizabeth hid her ulcerated scalp beneath horsehair and pearls. Both chose concealment over exposure, for to show decay was to invite chaos. Even collapse could not break the ritual. In the winter of 1601, one servant reported that Elizabeth fainted during a council meeting. Infection had spread, deep fever burned her body, and she slumped forward. But before she had fully regained consciousness, attendants rushed to reapply her wig. The council chamber could not witness the Queen unveiled. Sovereignty itself demanded the mask endure. Thus pain became policy. Every court appearance was a performance of gore and grandeur. Servants stood with perfumed fans to waft away the stench. Maids dabbed her brow where blood seeped through pins. Pages adjusted the towering curls that sat like monuments above her head. To see her was to witness majesty. To serve her was to witness torment. Comparisons with ceremonial armour are telling. Just as a knight's armour concealed wounds and blood, Elizabeth's wigs concealed sores and infection. Knights wore steel to preserve the image of invincibility. Elizabeth wore horsehair to preserve the illusion of immortality. Armour bruised flesh, wigs poisoned scalps. Both turned pain into performance, suffering into sovereignty. The wigs themselves became increasingly elaborate as her natural hair vanished. Some stood so high they scraped chapel ceilings. Carpenters modified arches so that Gloriana could process into prayer without stooping. The architecture bent to her crown as if stone itself acknowledged the supremacy of illusion over truth. But the cost was staggering. Beneath the iron mesh her skin blistered. Lesions festered. The constant pressure warped her posture, pulling her head back unnaturally, stiffening her neck. Tremors shook her hands. Paranoia shadowed her mind. Yet she insisted on the ritual each dawn bring. The wig bless it, pin it, crown Messior. No one dared disobey. The wigs were sacrosanct quasi-relics of sovereignty. Guards watched them by night, attendants handled them with reverence. Priests blessed them with murmured prayers. They were not accessories, they were extensions of the state. To let them slip, to allow them to falter, would have been to endanger the fiction upon which Elizabeth's reign stood. This fiction was her greatest weapon. Foreign envoys wrote of her brilliance, her majesty, her theatrical presence. They noted the smell, the stiffness, the fainting fits, but they also admitted her charisma remained intact. Even half consumed by infection, she projected authority. Even while blood stained the linen beneath her wig, she radiated sovereignty. It was sovereignty bought with agony. Elizabeth transformed her own scalp into a battlefield where endurance equalled legitimacy. Each pin driven into an ulcer, each brace pressing into bone, was another declaration the Queen does not falter. England does not falter. And so she endured day after day, year after year, until her body could no longer sustain the torment. But until that end came, the mask never slipped. By the turn of the 17th century, Elizabeth's reign was a performance balanced on the edge of collapse. The Virgin Queen still dazzled her subjects, still commanded armies, and Parliament still appeared in portraits as radiant Gloriana. Yet behind the curtains of her privy chamber her body was giving way. Her hands trembled constantly, the tremors of a body saturated with mercury and lead. Insomnia plagued her nights. She wandered restlessly, refusing food, whispering to her ladies that if she closed her eyes she might never wake again. Fingers curled into claws from stiffness joints, ached until she could barely lift her goblet, and fainting spells punctuated council meetings. The woman who had once been celebrated for her laughter and sharp wit now veered into rages over the smallest offence, an unpinned wig, an uneven layer of powder, a servant's hesitation. Attendants bore the brunt of her paranoia. Some were banished in fits of fury only to be recalled days later when she wept for their return, and yet every morning the performance resumed. A day in Elizabeth's late court began before dawn for her ladies-in-waiting. They entered her chamber in silence, arms laden with their perfumes, powders and garments. The air was already thick, incense smoldered through the night to mask the odour of sores. Candles guttered against the heavy tapestries that trapped heat and scent. The Queen sat stiffly in her chair, exhausted from sleepless hours, but ready for the ritual. First came the perfumes, cloths dipped in rosewater and vinegar, dabbed against her skin not to cleanse but to consecrate. Then the ceruse painted carefully over ulcers and scars. Hours could pass as attendants layered paste upon paste, patching cracks where the skin peeled, smoothing over the rawness that would not heal. Next vermilion to the lips, cinnabar rouge to the cheeks, lamp black to the lashes. Drops of belladonna widened her pupils until her gaze gleamed otherworldly, though blurred. It was labour as exhausting as it was dangerous. Attendants sweated under the heat of torches, their own lungs filling with powders, their hands trembling from hours of careful application. A slip of the brush could provoke fury. A mirror accidentally angled might bring banishment. One maid later confessed that she often fainted during these preparations, overwhelmed by the sickly mix of perfume, sweat and rot. Still the ritual continued because it had to. Once the paint was complete, the wig was chosen. A chaplain murmured prayers as guards fetched the chest. The wig was lifted with ceremony pinned into place upon the iron mesh that cut into her scalp. Sometimes blood welled from the pressure. A maid would discreetly dab it away before powdering over the spot. Elizabeth rarely flinched. "My scalp holds the realm," she once snapped when asked to rest. It was not exaggeration. To appear bareheaded would be to admit weakness. The wig was more than adornment, it was policy. By midday the Queen emerged to her court. To nobles, ambassadors and poets she seemed radiant, glowing in light that bounced off her powdered face and pearls. They saw no sores, no tremors, no sleepless nights. They saw Gloriana eternal and untouchable. The truth remained behind the curtains. Their attendants worked like unseen stagehands, repairing the mask after each performance. They changed her gowns when sweat stiffened the linen, reapplied powders when sores cracked through paint, repinned wigs when faintness loosened them. The Queen never rested, and so neither did they. Their labour was invisible, yet without it the myth of Elizabeth would have crumbled. The toll on her household was immense. Accounts from disgraced ladies, those dismissed in rages, describe exhaustion, nausea and despair. Yet many returned when called bound not by affection alone, but by the knowledge that they were sustaining a legend. They were not merely servants, they were custodians of a myth that held England together. For Elizabeth herself, the contradiction sharpened daily. Her body sagged, her jaw ached. Her hands curled, yet her image remained frozen timeless. The effort to sustain that image consumed every waking hour. Where once she had delighted in dance and music, she now retreated to her chambers, demanding only that the mask endure. Thus the Queen lived her last years in a perpetual night delirium from poisons, exhaustion from sleeplessness, paranoia from pain. Yet each dawn, through the sweat and labour of her ladies, she rose again, crowned in paint and horsehair, to play her part upon the stage of sovereignty. The illusion held for her people, for her enemies, perhaps even for herself. But illusions cannot banish mortality. The long night was drawing toward its end. The last days of Elizabeth Tudor were a vigil stretched across weeks. She would not lie in her bed. She would not change her clothes. Draped in velvet, she stood or sat upon cushions rigid as a statue, her eyes wide and restless. Her ladies begged her to rest. She refused. "If I close my eyes," she whispered, "I shall never open them again." It was not bravado, it was prophecy. By March of 1603, the Queen was 70 years old, her body hollowed by decades of poisons and performance. Her fingers curled into claws, her skin waxy beneath the mask of Carus, her joints locked stiff from years of stays and pins. She had eaten little for weeks, yet still she resisted the one act she had resisted all her life surrender. She feared that if she slept, the mask would slip and the kingdom would see the woman beneath. Her attendants watched helplessly as exhaustion devoured her. She muttered prayers, stared at shadows on the walls, waved away food, refused even broth. She sat in silence for hours, barely moving, a pale effigy surrounded by anxious courtiers. And then at last, silence became stillness. On the 24th of the March, Elizabeth V, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen. The woman who had outlasted Assassins the Armada and endless scandal died at Richmond Palace. She had ruled England for 44 years, but her end was not serene. Within hours, the illusion unraveled. Her corpse began to swell. Skin darkened and oozed despite the cool air of late winter. Physicians rushed to explain the speed of her decomposition. Some blamed her age, others the dampness of the Thameside Palace, others the candles burning in vigil. But whispers spread quickly. The Queen was rotting faster than nature allowed. The truth may lie in her own choices. For decades, Elizabeth had saturated her flesh with lead-based ceruse mercury rouge, belladonna drops, perfumed oils and mould-ridden wigs. These toxins had been absorbed into her bloodstream, her organs, her very bones. In life they had poisoned her slowly. In death they turned her body into a chemical brew. When the animating spirit fled, the poisons remained accelerating putrefaction. Her body was not preserved, it was primed to collapse. The chamber became unbearable. Maids tried to mask the stench with rosewater, scattering herbs across the floor. A dish of vinegar was placed at her feet, a medieval trick against decay. Still the odour thickened. Even her most loyal attendants fainted or vomited behind curtains. At last the room was sealed. Tudor embalming practices were crude by modern standards. The body was washed with alcohol or vinegar cavities, stuffed with spices, the skin anointed with balm. But Elizabeth's flesh defied these rituals. Beneath the powder, her cheeks split. Her lips blackened and sealed together. Liquid seeped from her nostrils. Her neck ballooned grotesquely. The embalmers worked frantically, but the poisons within her resisted preservation. Her coffin was lined with crimson, replaced once after the odour seeped through. Guards were ordered to rotate every 10 minutes during her lying in state. The smell was too much to bear. One observer noted that flies swarmed not around the funeral flowers, but around the bier itself. Winter should have slowed decay. Cold stone halls and frosty air usually preserved bodies for days, even weeks. Yet Elizabeth's corpse seemed to rebel against the season, breaking down with startling speed. In their confusion, physicians muttered about humours and vapours. Modern toxicology suggests something closer to truth lead, and mercury weakened tissues, rupture vessels, and corrupt organs. Her body, long saturated, was simply too fragile to withstand death's advance. The symbolism was as brutal as the reality. Elizabeth had spent her reign hiding weakness, painting over scars, perfuming sores, masking hair loss, silencing coughs. In death the mask fell away. The sovereign who had insisted on eternal youth decomposed faster than any monarch in memory. Even her grave could not contain the stench. Yet still the illusion persisted in public. Her funeral procession wound through London with solemn majesty. The coffin was draped in cloth of gold, the effigy above it serene painted, with smooth cheeks and crimson lips. The people wept, not knowing that beneath the silk their queen's body was collapsing into foulness. They believed the mask. They always had. And so Elizabeth's final paradox endured. The woman who refused to sleep for fear of death became in death a figure her attendants dared not approach. The queen who had defined an age by her image left behind a body that betrayed every artifice. The Virgin Queen, preserved in paintings as radiant Gloriana, rotted faster than any pauper. The mask had met the grave and the grave had triumphed. Elizabeth's death had been swift in body, but her funeral had to be slow in ceremony. She had ruled for 44 years. Her passing could not be a private collapse. It had to be a pageant, an act of state theatre powerful enough to disguise the rot within her coffin. The preparations began at Richmond, where embalmers fought a losing battle. Beneath the cracked layers of ceruse, her skin split, liquid seeped her cheeks, sagged, her lips sealed together. The death mask was repainted, her hands hidden in gloves, her chin swaddled in lace, so dense that only the outline remained. The illusion broken in life had to be restored in death. Her bier was draped in crimson and cloth of gold. The coffin lined in silk had already been replaced once after fluid stained the lining. Guards were stationed at her side, ordered to rotate every 10 minutes. The stench was unbearable. Bowls of vinegar were set beneath the bier, rosemary strewn across the floors, incense burned until courtiers choked. Still flies gathered not around flowers but around the queen herself. Yet when the day of procession arrived, illusion triumphed. London had not seen such a spectacle since her coronation. Thousands lined the streets, craning for a glimpse of their virgin queen, one last time. Heralds marched in black livery, carrying banners emblazoned with the Tudor rose and the royal arms. Nobles rode behind cloaked in mourning, their horses draped in sable. The coffin moved slowly on a great hearse borne high, so that all might see though no one was permitted to approach. Atop the coffin lay an effigy waxen, serene ageless. Painted cheeks glowed pale, and unlined lips, crimson eyes, open, as though gazing upon eternity. The effigy was not Elizabeth's face, but the face she demanded the world remember. In life she had outlawed mirrors, in death she outlawed decay. The streets shook with mourning. Bells tolled from every steeple, women wept openly, men bowed their heads. Children were lifted onto shoulders to glimpse the passing bier. They saw not the truth, the swelling corpse, the fluid staining silk, but the spectacle a queen transformed into icon. The mechanics of such a funeral were immense. City wardens cleared pathways, soldiers managed crowds, heralds cried the order of march. Drummers beat slow rhythms muffled so that the solemnity, not the noise, carried. Clergy walked in ranks, chanting prayers over the body politic, even as the body natural collapsed within. Every detail was orchestrated to ensure that grief was channeled into reverence, not scandal. Yet whispers still spread among those closest. Guards confessed to nausea. Some claimed the odour seeped through the coffin even outdoors, forcing them to hold vinegar-soaked cloths to their faces. One chronicler observed flies swarming not at garlands, but at the bier itself, a grotesque counterpoint to the flowers strewn in tribute. Still none of this reached the crowd. The spectacle drowned the smell. For Tudor England, the funeral was more than farewell, it was a reaffirmation of monarchy. The Virgin Queen was not allowed to collapse like an ordinary woman. She was to be borne through her city as eternal Gloriana, the monarch who had defeated the Armada, patronised Shakespeare, and ushered in an age of relative stability. Whatever lay inside the coffin, the pageant outside had to declare triumph. Inside Westminster Abbey, the final act unfolded. The coffin, draped and veiled, was lowered into the vault beside her half-sister Mary Tudor. The irony was sharp. Two women divided by religion, one Protestant, one Catholic, now lay side by side in the same stone embrace. Above them the wax effigy smiled, still untouched by time, a mask of eternal youth presiding over the grave. The spectacle had succeeded. The people left believing in the myth. They remembered the banners, the tolling bells, the effigy radiant upon the bier. They did not know of the guards who gagged the embalmers who failed, the chamber sealed against stench. They carried home the story Elizabeth wanted, the last performance of Gloriana. And yet history whispers the other tale of Perfume that could not mask decay of flies that betrayed what paint and lace concealed of a queen whose body had been poisoned by her own illusions. Her funeral was a victory of myth over mortality, but the grave did not care. Elizabeth Tudor was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey on a March morning in 1603. The last pageant was over. The bells had fallen silent, and the city that once trembled with her voice was hushed. She was placed in the vault beside Mary Vaux, the half-sister who had sought to erase her. Two women divided by religion, temperament, and politics united at last in stone. Above them, effigies carved in marble looked serene as if time itself had spared them. But marble tells one story, flesh tells another. The Elizabeth remembered by her people, pale, radiant, eternal, is not the Elizabeth her servants carried to the grave. The Virgin Queen who inspired poets, defied popes, and routed the Armada, was also the woman whose breath sickened courtiers, whose wigs crawled with vermin, whose body festered beneath layers of oils and paint. These two Elizabeths, the myth and the mortal, coexisted uneasily. In life she laboured to suppress the second with the first. In death the myth prevailed. For what endured was not the smell of her chamber, but the sight of her portraits. Painters had long obeyed orders to smooth her wrinkles, brighten her eyes, whiten her den. Their work survived while the testimony of envoys and servants lingered only in letters and whispers. The people remembered the pageant, not the stench. The body was hidden, the myth preserved. This was not accident. It was politics. Elizabeth's reign was built on performance, the controlled sight of her painted face, the perfumed fog that veiled her flesh, the strict choreography of meals and appearances. Sovereignty itself became sensory sight and smell as instruments of power. To see her radiant was to believe in her strength. To smell roses instead of sweat was to imagine her divine. Illusion was not a mask for weakness. It was the mechanism of rule. And yet illusion has costs. The poison she painted onto her skin entered her bloodstream, corrupted her organs, hastened her decline. The wigs that signified majesty festered with mould and lice. The corsets that symbolized discipline opened sores that never healed. Each artifact of sovereignty exacted a toll upon the body that bore it. The queen paid for her reign with her flesh. There is also the cost of gender. Male monarchs could limp, bleed, or display wounds as proofs of valour. For a woman on the throne, the stakes were different. Any sign of fragility could be weaponized as evidence that she was unfit to rule. Elizabeth knew this, and so she converted pain into power. She forbade flinching even as teeth rotted. She banned mirrors even as sores spread. She insisted her scalp held the crown even as infection reached bone. Her endurance was not just personal stubbornness, it was the price of female sovereignty in a hostile world. In this, Elizabeth left a legacy both triumphant and tragic. She proved that a woman could rule England for 4 decades, outwit kings and popes, command armies and diplomats. But she also showed the human cost of maintaining that illusion, a life lived behind paint and powder perfume, and pearls, a reign sustained by silence about her decay. The myth endured longer than the body. To this day we speak of the Elizabethan age as a golden one, Shakespeare, Drake, Spencer, the Armada defeated empire beginning. Children learn of Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the goddess robed in pearls. Few are told of the sores beneath the corsets, the tremors from mercury, the wig linings alive with vermin. History prefers the mask, and yet looking beneath the mask has its own value. For in her painted body we see the politics of monarchy stripped bare. We see how power is constructed from image, how perception shapes reality, how sight and smell can command obedience as surely as armies. We see how gender forced Elizabeth into a relentless performance of divinity, how sovereignty demanded that she deny mortality until mortality could no longer be denied. This is not to diminish her triumphs, it is to understand them. The Armada was beaten not only by ships and storms, but by a queen who convinced her people she was immortal. Shakespeare's plays flourished not only by genius, but by patronage from a monarch who needed theatre to sustain her own. The politics of the age were inseparable from the cosmetics of the queen. And so Elizabeth's legacy is a paradox. She remains immortal in memory precisely because she spent her life defying the reality of decay. Her body rotted beneath the mask, but the mask became history. Standing in Westminster today beside the tomb where she lies with Mary, one can still sense that paradox. The marble effigy is serene, the inscriptions triumphant. The silence of the abbey cloaks the truth of her corpse, which once oozed so quickly that guards fainted and flies swarmed. Stone remembers the myth, flesh remembered the cost. What do we as quiet historians take from this? Perhaps the lesson is not merely about Elizabeth, but about power itself. Sovereignty always masks weakness, propaganda always perfumes decay. Every crown is a wig powdered with starch, every portrait a Carus mask painted over flaws. The politics of image are eternal. and yet beneath every mask there is still flesh. It bleeds, it festers, it rots, no matter how brilliant the illusion mortality waits. Elizabeth's reign endures in legend because she mastered illusion. But we remember her truly only when we look beneath the powder, when we smell the roses that had soured, when we glimpse the sores beneath the silk. It is in that tension between divinity and decay that the real Elizabeth resides. A queen, a myth, a woman who paid with her body to embody a kingdom. Life lessons beneath the powder. When we stand back from Elizabeth's story, we see more than a monarch who ruled for 44 years. We see a woman who taught us through both triumph and torment what it means to live inside an illusion and what it costs to preserve it. Her reign reminds us that power is never only armies, laws, or ships. It is also image. Elizabeth's painted face, perfume chamber, and jewelled wigs were as much tools of statecraft as her navy. She understood that people believe what they see and often what they smell. She turned cosmetics into politics, transforming weakness into spectacle. In doing so, she kept her throne, yet the same tools that gave her strength also destroyed her. The lead that masked her scars seeped into her blood. The wigs that projected majesty tore at her scalp. The corsets that proclaimed discipline carved wounds into her flesh. Every prop of sovereignty exacted a toll. From her we learn that illusions can sustain us, but if we cling too tightly, they can consume us. There is also the lesson of gender. Elizabeth ruled in a world convinced that women were unfit for command. She refused to give her enemies the satisfaction of seeing her falter. She turned endurance into ideology, making pain her language of legitimacy. In her declaration that she had the body of a weak and feeble woman, but the heart and stomach of a king, we hear both defiance and burden. From her, we learn that sometimes survival requires performance and that the stage can become a prison. We also learn about the power of silence. Courtiers did not speak of her sores, diplomats only hinted at her stench, painters erased her wrinkles. A conspiracy of silence preserved the mask, but silence has its cost. By refusing to acknowledge truth, the court condemned their queen to suffer alone. From this we learn the importance of honesty, not the cruel exposure of weakness, but the compassion of truth that allows healing. Perhaps the deepest lesson is one of mortality. Elizabeth's life was a battle to escape decay. Perfume over sweat, paint over scars, wigs over baldness. But in the end, death triumphed. Her body rotted faster than any commoner's, undone by the very substances meant to preserve it. No crown, no mask, no myth can erase the laws of flesh. From her we learn that mortality is not a failure but a fact. The only choice is how we face it. And here lies her paradoxical gift. For though her flesh decayed, her myth endured. We remember Gloriana, not the sores. We speak of the Elizabethan Golden Age, not the vinegar baths and maggot-ridden wigs. In this way, she teaches us that stories outlast bodies. What we craft in words, portraits, and memory becomes our true legacy. So perhaps the final lesson is this: to live knowing that image matters, but truth matters more, to honour myth without forgetting flesh, to see beneath the powder and still find meaning there. Make sure to leave a comment with your thoughts or perspective, and most importantly, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell.